The Gulf waters shimmered under the pale gold of an early morning sun, the kind of day that lured fishermen out even before the harbor's coffee shops had opened. The Marina Belle, a modest trawler with a scuffed blue hull and a deck that smelled of salt and diesel, had just left the breakwater. Captain Luis Ortega stood at the helm, eyes scanning the horizon where the sea met the cloudless sky. His crew, Rafael, a wiry deckhand with sunburned arms, and Mateo, the youngest at barely 20, were checking nets and bait crates, moving in the easy rhythm of men who'd done this hundreds of times. Everything about the morning felt right, until the first pelican appeared. Luis spotted it off the port bow, flying unusually low, its wings slicing the air in short, sharp beats. Brown pelicans were common in these waters, but this one moved with a frantic energy that unsettled him. It circled once, twice, then dove, hard, into the waves. Normally, pelicans hit the water cleanly, disappearing in a neat plunge before resurfacing with a wriggling fish. But this bird erupted back into the air in a chaotic splash, empty-beaked, and immediately climbed for another dive. Something spooked him, Raphael muttered, shading his eyes. Luis didn't answer. His gaze tracked the bird as it repeated the strange, jerking maneuver, diving and retreating without catching anything. Then, he noticed something else. The pelican wasn't hunting randomly. Each plunge landed in almost the exact same spot, about 30 meters from their intended fishing path. Mateo laughed nervously. Maybe it's guarding a favorite fishing hole. Luis's stomach tightened. He'd been on these waters long enough to know that animals didn't waste energy without reason. Or maybe it's trying to stay alive, he said quietly. He reached for the throttle and slowed the trawler. The crew exchanged puzzled glances, but Luis was already leaning over the rail, watching the water's surface. The waves here moved differently, an irregular chop against the wind's direction, like something was pushing from beneath. The pelican dove again, this time surfacing farther away, its wings beating hard as it left the spot altogether. Luis stared at the place it had abandoned. In the brief lull between swells, he saw it, a faint, unnatural shimmer under the water, spreading like a ghostly cloud. His chest went cold. Pull the nets, he ordered sharply. We're not dropping anything here. Raphael hesitated. Why? We're in prime. Do it, Luis barked, his voice edged with urgency. The water around that shimmering patch was not safe. He didn't know exactly why yet, but the pelican's erratic warning had been enough. And in treacherous waters, sometimes your only alarm was a creature desperate enough to break its own patterns. The Marina Belle idled, engine rumbling low, as the crew reeled in the nets they'd just begun to ready. Luis kept his eyes locked on the strange patch of sea ahead, watching how the swells bent around it. The rest of the Gulf's surface rolled with a smooth, predictable rhythm, but here the water seemed restless, twisting, forming small whirlpools that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Raphael leaned over the starboard rail, squinting. Could be a school of bait fish, he said, though his tone was uncertain. Maybe the pelican was just... Bait fish don't make the current run backward, Luis cut in. He pointed toward the spot. Look there. See how it fights the tide? That's no school. That's something pushing up from the bottom. Mateo's brow furrowed. Like a sandbar? Luis shook his head. Too deep here, and too sharp. The pelican was long gone now, a dark speck heading toward the mainland. In its absence, the sea felt heavier, as if the bird had taken with it the last bit of warning they'd get. Luis reached for the boat's handheld sonar unit, a tool they usually used to locate fish shoals. He dropped the transducer into the water and watched the small digital screen flicker. At first, nothing. Then, faint outlines began to form, a slope where the seabed should have been flat, ending in an odd, jagged rise. He frowned. The shape wasn't rock. It had clean edges, too regular, like something manufactured. Metal? Raphael guessed, peering at the screen. Before Luis could answer, a new movement caught his attention. The shimmering cloud beneath the surface began to spread outward, faint tendrils curling into the clearer water. He leaned in, inhaling sharply as a chemical tang hit his nose, a smell out of place on the open water. Diesel, he said quietly. And not from us. Mateo stepped back from the rail, his face pale. You think it's a wreck? Luis's mind was already working ahead. A leaking hull, hidden just beneath the surface, could be deadly, especially in shifting Gulf currents. Boats running too close could strike it, snag nets, or worse, breach their own hulls. He started the engine back up and turned the bow away from the patch. We're not staying here. I'm calling it in. As the Marina Bell eased away, the first larger swell rolled over the shimmer, temporarily hiding it. But Luis knew it was still there, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look, just waiting. And if the Pelican hadn't been so agitated, they might have been the ones to find it the hard way. Luis eased the Marina Bell to a safe distance before reaching for the VHF radio. His thumb hovered over the transmit button for a moment, long enough to feel the weight of what he was about to report. Out here, false alarms weren't taken lightly, but neither was ignoring a warning. Coast Guard Sector Clearwater. This is Marina Bell, he said, voice steady. We've got possible hazardous obstruction at coordinates. He read off the numbers from the GPS, his eyes never leaving the water where the shimmer still lingered in the distance. Suspected submerged wreck. Strong chemical odor, likely fuel or diesel leak. Requesting immediate inspection. Static filled the cabin for a few seconds, before a clipped professional voice replied, Copy, Marina Bell. Maintain visual if possible. Keep a minimum quarter-mile radius. Patrol vessel will be dispatched. Luis acknowledged and hung the mic back on its hook. He stepped outside, where Rafael and Mateo were watching him closely. They're sending someone, Luis said. We stay put until they get eyes on it. The younger fisherman shifted uneasily. Captain, what if the leak spreads? It's already moving with the current. Luis knew he was right. The faint, oily sheen was growing, thin rainbows flashing on the crests of the swells. That's why we keep eyes on it, and we keep everyone else away. He turned up the channel on the radio that broadcast local boat chatter. Almost immediately, he caught snippets of voices. Charter captains, private skippers, and shrimp trawlers, exchanging their usual early morning talk. Luis keyed in, his tone firm but calm. To all vessels in range, this is Marina Bell. Avoid the area 1 mile east of marker buoy 14. Possible wreck and fuel spill. Dangerous currents. Repeat. Stay clear until cleared by Coast Guard. The replies came in a mix of thanks and skepticism. Not everyone liked taking advice from another fisherman, but Luis didn't care if they thought he was being dramatic. He'd seen too many good boats run aground on things that shouldn't be there. Minutes passed. The sun rose higher, casting blinding glare across the water. The shimmer became harder to spot, unless you knew exactly where to look. Luis kept the bow angled toward it, afraid that if he blinked too long, it would vanish completely, until the next unlucky boat found it. The sound of a distant engine grew louder, steady and purposeful. Through the haze of heat rising off the water, a white patrol cutter began to take shape on the horizon. Relief flickered through Luis, but it was mixed with something else, a nagging thought about that Pelican. It had been here long before they'd arrived, sounding its own alarm. And in a strange way, he felt like he was just finishing the job it had started. The Coast Guard cutter slowed as it approached, its wake fanning out across the calm Gulf water. A crew member on the bow raised a hand in greeting before signaling for the Marina Bell to hold position. Luis acknowledged with a nod, keeping the trawler's engine idling low. A rigid-hulled inflatable boat splashed into the water from the cutter's stern, 2 Coast Guard divers already suited up inside. They motored toward the shimmering patch with practiced efficiency, their boat rocking gently as they drifted over the suspected wreck site. Luis, Rafael, and Mateo watched from a distance, the tension on deck so thick it muted even the gulls overhead. One of the divers slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple. The second followed, leaving only a faint trail of bubbles to mark their descent. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher, burning off the early haze and painting the waves in sharp, glittering blues. Luis's eyes stayed fixed on the bubbles, noting how they circled in slow arcs before converging again. Something about the pattern suggested the divers were moving cautiously, scanning every inch. Finally, a dark shape broke the surface. A helmeted head, followed by the diver's shoulders. He lifted his mask and shouted to the inflatable boat operator, the wind carrying fragments of his voice. Rusted hull, breach on starboard, leaking from fuel tank. Luis's gut tightened. He'd guessed a wreck, but hearing confirmation made it more real. The second diver surfaced moments later, pulling himself aboard the inflatable. They conferred briefly, then radioed back to the cutter. Luis caught the words, "unstable structure," and "mark and monitor until salvage crew arrives." The inflatable sped back to the cutter, leaving the diver's findings in its wake. Soon after, bright orange buoys were dropped into the water around the hazard, their colors jarring against the serene blue of the sea. From a distance, the scene might have looked almost peaceful, if not for the faint rainbow sheen still swirling inside the marked zone. Raphael exhaled sharply. "Could have been us hitting that thing," he said, his voice low. "Could have been anyone," Luis replied. Mateo leaned on the rail, his eyes following the buoys bobbing in the current. That Pelican, it knew something was wrong, like it didn't want to be near it. Luis didn't argue. In his mind, the bird's frantic dives replayed again and again, each one hitting the same dangerous spot, like a warning written in the only language it had. The Coast Guard hailed the Marina Bell, thanking them for the report and clearing them to continue fishing elsewhere. But as Luis turned the wheel, guiding the trawler away from the scene, he kept glancing back at the buoys. Under the glassy surface, the wreck still lurked, a silent, hidden danger they would have never known about, if not for one distressed bird breaking its routine. With the wreck now marked and the Coast Guard on watch, Luis steered the Marina Bell toward deeper waters, well clear of the hazard zone. The sun was high enough to turn the sea a blazing silver, the kind of glare that made you squint even under the brim of a cap. The crew moved quietly, the morning's adrenaline still lingering in their bones. They worked in near silence, as Raphael set the nets and Mateo checked the lines, but every so often one of them would glance back toward the horizon where the bright orange buoys floated. Even from miles away, the markers stood out like a warning sign in the middle of nowhere. "Feels different out here now," Mateo said finally, breaking the quiet. "Like the water's watching us." Luis gave a small grunt. "The water's always watching. Today, it just gave us a messenger." Raphael shot him a look. "You mean that Pelican?" Luis nodded without hesitation. Bird wasn't just fishing. It was trying to stay away from that spot, and make sure we did too. They fell into the rhythm of the day's work, hauling in a modest catch. The Gulf was generous but not endless, and Luis had always believed in taking only what they needed. Still, even as he focused on the nets and the weight of the lines, part of his mind stayed with the morning's events. By midday, they'd filled enough bins to make the trip worthwhile. Luis called for the gear to be stowed, the boat turning toward home. The horizon shimmered with heat, the coast a faint dark line in the distance. Gulls followed in their wake, hopeful for scraps, their cries sharp against the steady hum of the engine. It was then that Luis spotted it, a lone brown pelican, gliding parallel to the boat about 30 yards off. Its flight was steady now, wings catching thermals in slow, graceful arcs. Every so often, it had glanced toward the trawler, its long beak angled slightly, as though checking in. Luis kept his eyes on the bird until it veered away, heading toward a cluster of sandbars, just visible in the afternoon light. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and humility. In his decades on the water, he'd trusted tides, wind, sonar, and the instincts of his crew. But today, their safety had hinged on something wilder, older, and far less predictable. When they finally reached the harbor, the Marina Bell slid into its berth with the ease of a seasoned hand. Luis secured the lines, casting one last glance over the shimmering expanse of the Gulf. Somewhere out there, the wreck still waited beneath the waves, and the Pelican that had found it had returned to its own world, leaving the humans to take the warning from here. By the time the Marina Bell was tied off and the day's catch unloaded, the story had already started to move along the docks like a tide. Other fishermen stopped what they were doing to hear Raphael tell it, how a single, frantic pelican had drawn their captain's attention, how the water around it shimmered with fuel, and how the Coast Guard had confirmed a wreck just under the surface. Most listened with interest, a few with raised eyebrows. Some grinned and shook their heads, muttering about old sea superstitions and bird-watching captains. But others, especially the ones who'd been in close calls themselves, nodded in quiet agreement. Animals see things we don't, an older skipper said, leaning on a piling. Ignore that, and you're asking for trouble. Luis kept mostly quiet, letting his crew tell it in their own way. The important part was that people heard the warning. The gulf was wide, but word of mouth among fishermen traveled fast. And by sunset, the coordinates of the hazard were being passed between boats as surely as the day's best fishing spots. Later, while the crew sat at a dockside cafe over steaming bowls of seafood stew, a pair of Coast Guard officers walked in. They made their way to the table and thanked Luis directly, explaining that the wreck appeared to be an old shrimp trawler lost during a storm years ago, its hull fractured, fuel trapped in a corroded tank until recent currents freed the leak. Could have been a disaster if another vessel struck it, one officer said, especially in rough weather. You saved people a lot of trouble. Luis only nodded, but inwardly he thought of the Pelican. Without that bird's erratic dives, they would have steamed straight into danger without a second thought. As evening settled over the harbor, the water in the marina reflected streaks of orange and pink from the sinking sun. Luis lingered by the boat after the others left, the hum of distant engines and the slap of waves against the pilings filling the quiet. Out beyond the breakwater, he spotted movement, a dark silhouette gliding just above the water's surface. A pelican, wings outstretched, coasting toward the open gulf. It didn't look back. Luis watched it disappear into the distance, the fading light turning the horizon to silver. He felt the same as he had that morning, aware that the line between chance and warning could be thin, and that sometimes survival depended on noticing the smallest ripples in the world around you. The following week brought calmer seas and steady work. The wreck remained marked by bright buoys, and the Coast Guard had begun planning a salvage operation to remove the leaking hull before winter storms could scatter its remains. Word of the hazard, and of the Marina Bell's role in finding it, had spread far beyond the harbor. Luis even received a call from a maritime safety office in another port, thanking him for quick thinking and sharp eyes. But Luis knew it hadn't been just his eyes. Early one morning, before the crew arrived, he walked alone down the creaking dock to the boat. The air was still, the gulf smooth as glass. He leaned on the rail and let his gaze wander toward the open water, remembering the moment that Pelican had broken the calm with its wild, frantic dives. It hadn't been fear exactly, it had been urgency, the kind that demands a response whether you understand it or not. He thought about how many dangers in the sea went unseen until it was too late. Sandbars that shifted with the season, storm fronts hiding behind clear skies, a corroded hull waiting silently beneath a shimmer in the waves. And he thought about how sometimes your best warning didn't come from radar, sonar, or weather charts. It came from the wild things that lived in the same world but played by different rules. When Rafael and Mateo arrived, coffee in hand, Luis was already untying the lines. "We heading to the deep shelf today?" Rafael asked. "Yeah," Luis said, "and we keep our eyes open for more than fish." They eased out of the harbor, the Marina Bell cutting a clean path through the morning calm. As the breakwater slipped behind them, a lone brown pelican appeared off their starboard side, gliding effortlessly over the surface. For a few moments it matched their pace, wings steady against the rising light. Then, with a tilt of its head and a slow bank, it peeled away toward a distant sandbar. Luis watched it go, a faint smile on his face. The bird had its own currents to follow, its own unspoken routes across the gulf. But he'd remember what it had taught him. Danger doesn't always announce itself in a way humans understand. Sometimes you just have to notice when the world is trying to tell you something, and trust the messenger, no matter what shape it takes. The trawler pushed on into open water, its wake dissolving behind it, leaving the lesson to ripple quietly in the captain's mind.